But let's switch gears and talk about our trending topic, the psychology of collegiate sports, specifically the issue of paying college athletes. Now, why are we talking about this today? Well, this past September, California Governor Gavin Newsom signed into law a measure that allows players to receive endorsement deals despite the NCAA calling the move unconstitutional. When asked about the NCAA's differing view on the subject, Governor Newsom said, "I have deep reverence, deep respect for the NCAA and college athletes. I just think the system has been perverted, and this is fundamentally about rebalancing things. It's about equity, it's about fairness, and it's about time." So let me throw this out to you guys. We can get a little bit into the nuances, but first, what's your general read or opinion about allowing student athletes receive some type of revenue or compensation?
So it's interesting because before being asked to be a part of this podcast, I had opinions and thoughts, and they kind of bounced all over. It's like I can see both sides of the argument, kind of like as a therapist. You kind of just try to see both sides of the argument. But what I learned through my research is that I actually am clearly on one side, and that side is for paying athletes. My undergraduate degree is in business and psychology, so business is a part of the way in which my brain works, and we work in private practice, so that's another piece. So it just does not make sense in our society, in American society, that we don't pay people for something that they are generating. And if you look at the data, these athletes generate substantial amounts of money for NCAA and for college athletics as a whole. And I have those statistics. We can go over them as we're going through this. But just college athletics in and of themselves, they bring in $14 billion a year. So if these individuals, like you talk about Zion Williamson, who just graduated, he didn't gain a penny.
He didn't graduate.
I'm not graduate. I'm sorry. Yeah, you're right. The one and done rule, which we'll cover at some point as well. But let's say when he busted that shoe open, if that could have been the end of his career, and then his earning potential all of a sudden drops. Now he's making millions, and he's going to be fine. But there's a lot of risk there, and they're the one that's generating this money. How are they not seeing any return on that investment? As a businessman, if I have a business, it's not about making it fair in the sense that everyone gets the same. It's what are you generating? So we can get into that in Title IX and all that. But my opinion, I guess to answer your original question, is I lean towards paying them than not.
I will agree with that. But I get lost in the weeds of how that would even occur. And I also kind of get lost in this, okay, so it's okay to pay them. Then, what are the boosters doing? What is the undue influence of certain companies? I don't know, it just seems really, really complicated to me, and I can see why colleges haven't done it. But also, one of the other things that I think about is, okay, so Zion gets paid whatever for playing for Duke, but then what about the guy sitting on the bench? How do you figure that out? It seems so subjective. And then also, how do you also recognize Duke is $80,000 a year? I mean, that's payment as well. So it's complicated, and I'm also very worried that unless every college does this, then the colleges that pay are going to get the good athletes, and the lesser colleges. I mean, it almost becomes the Yankees.
But doesn't that already happen in some ways? Doesn't Duke or the Tar Heels by nature have an advantage already?
Yeah, the blue blood programs, the Kansas, the Kentucky, you're talking about college basketball.
But I think that's based on their history.
I mean, but they're going to get the higher level athletes right there.
Well, if North Carolina's not paying a college athlete and UCLA is, and we're both recruiting the same guy, I mean, I don't know why we would win that.
But some would argue that gives it more balance potentially because it's not just one school. But then it could shift the balance because if the school has the most money, that can get the most players.
Right.
Well, and the interesting thing is we're talking about two different issues here. One is just fundamentally paying college athletes, which is actually not what the California bill is really focusing on. It's giving them eligibility that they can make money through endorsement deals or get compensation for their likeness being used for other merchandise that other companies or the school receives compensation or revenue for. So in terms of like you talking about the 12th man on the bench, he may get something nominal if he's a part of EA Sports, college basketball, but the main star probably is going to have more opportunity and access for T-shirts and video game profiles and other things along those lines. But essentially, most of the revenue they're talking about is not from the institution itself.
Endorsements.
You're right.
So it's endorsement. But you brought up another complicating factor, at least right now as it stands, which would be an unfair advantage if only a few schools or one conference, adopts these governing rules and others don't. And then you do open it up to an extremely unfair advantage of USC, UCLA, California schools. They can get compensation where everywhere else you're still abiding by the NCAA.
We also, I think about the group dynamic as well. So let's say you've got a Zion, and he's making more money from endorsements than all the other players, or even maybe more than Krzyzewski. And like, what does that do in terms of the power dynamic?
I hear your point, but the other piece is like, there's 40 states that the highest earner in the state is college coaches. So it's this money is there and it's going to the coaches, and you call it amateurism. Like these kids are college, but then you're paying the coaches. So aren't they an amateur coach if these are amateur athletes?
Right.
Why are they being compensated greater than any other public official in the entire state? It just doesn't add up. And then to your other point about paying Zion versus the 12th man on the bench or the 15th man, don't we have that same issue in the NBA and LeBron James versus the 12th? So it's an issue that I think my pause initially why I thought it was more balanced is because I didn't have an answer, kind of like what you're saying. There's a lot of things that are going to come up, things that are going to arise that we have to solve, these problems that are going to arise, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't explore it and try to figure it out. I think it's something that we have done in other aspects that we can learn from those. But I think one other thing I want to throw out there is Governor Gavin Newsom, he also made an interesting quote. He said, every single student in the university can market their name, image, and likeness. They can go and get a YouTube channel, and they can monetize that. The only group that can't are athletes. Why is that?
Yeah,
and I think that's an outstanding question.
Well, and not only that, they can't. They're prohibited from doing that. But when you look at those figures, they're the ones that are also making the most money for the university. So that chasm is even larger because of that. Like an economics student or a liberal arts student, they can make their own YouTube channel. They may not be funneling direct revenue into the school the way a lot of Division I collegiate sports are. But let me shift a little bit more and let's step back and talk maybe about the infrastructure and system itself, because one of the things that oftentimes really strikes me in an unsettling way is when you think about this very narrow population that we restrict through the name of amateur eligibility. And then you brought up coaches that have free reign to negotiate their salary, to have compensation even if they get fired. They can switch schools without having any type of penalty. And you think about student athletes. If they transfer, they have to sit out a year. Other students can transfer and start at any other point. They could start a job, anything of those nature. But I'm curious about the power imbalance and what it means in terms of maybe gender, racial, or economic injustice, because it's not really lost on me that historically, and this is changing, but historically you have a majority of Division I athletes that are young people of color. And yet you have a majority of coaches or presidents or boards of these colleges, NCAA, people that are making these decisions that are predominantly white men. I mean, what are your thoughts about the potential of structural or systematic inequality at play here?
I feel like I'm not certain about that. I think there definitely could be an undertone there, but there's nothing that screams that. I think you can say major Division I athletes and their backgrounds and I don't know the data exactly, but I would assume it's lower SES lower socioeconomic statuses, and with that we can take advantage of those individuals. But I don't know from a systemic piece that factors in as much. I don't know. I've got to ponder that a little more.
Well, I think it's interesting that if we're talking about a majority of particular minority race is not only collegiate but then NBA, you would think that you'd have a lot more coaches due to their experience that are minority as well, because it's a bigger pool and there's a lot more experience. So I don't know.
Well, let me share a couple things for you guys that kind of may further confuse the issue or kind of help clarify of maybe some of the more subtle or unseen dynamics in terms of economic and racial disparity in the situation. 55% of men's basketball players in the so-called Power 5 major conferences schools are black, according to the NCAA data, while nearly half of the Power 5 football players are black. The performance of these unpaid players, many who come from low-income families, are often subsidizing sports like tennis, where 48% of men's tennis players in the power conferences are white and just 12% are black, and other sports that are even more exclusively white, like men's water polo, women's rowing, are predominantly white and are subsidized by the revenue that the predominantly black sports bring in. In fact, men's water polo, 82% of water polo players are white.
And probably rich.
Just 2% are people of color, and yet they are subsidizing those sports. Women's rowing, 75% are white. Here's another interesting piece of data, and I don't know what this means in terms of just sort of this unspoken bias of how we look at that, but when polled, a majority of people of color prefer professional sports over collegiate sports. And yet a majority of white sports fans prefer collegiate amateur sports over professional sports. Is there something rooted in there's an off-putting nature of black athletes being paid for what they do versus some type of racial kind of purity of playing sports for free, even though we know from a socioeconomic standpoint, a lot of athletes of color, they're not just looking to support themselves. They're looking to really open up an avenue to support their larger family unit. So some of these things outside of just paying college athletes or just perhaps like coaches or the institution presidents are white, there's something in terms of socioeconomic inequality and some subtle racial undertones. I don't know what it means, but there's something there. I mean, I don't know if you guys have any more thoughts about it.
I think there's tribalism for sure. If you think, okay, if you're going to crew, well, you've got to live near water. These boats are really expensive. There's a lot of upkeep, so there's a lot of money to be had there. But that also means you were probably doing crew in high school. So what kind of high schools have crew? And so you have these kind of wealthy white tribes of people, and we know that we tend to gravitate toward what seems familiar. But when you put it like, yeah, these teams and minorities are subsidizing these already wealthy, potentially wealthy families, it's messed up. It's super messed up.
Well, and I think maybe part of my jadedness, because I'm very open to a free market at a collegiate level. I mean, I understand the arguments for competitive nature, but if I came up with a patent at age 18, I could sell it to the highest bidder, the highest business company, and so I tend to be more of a free market type of person, even when it comes to sports. But I think part of my maybe disdain for the NCAA is I think even apart from this issue, I tend to view it already as corrupt and perverted. And I think you don't even have to look any further than this past year with the college admissions bribe scandal, in terms of predominantly affluent white families used sports as a loophole to get their kids into prestigious schools that for many of them, maybe most of them, they would not otherwise have been considered based upon their own merit. And this, again, I think I don't want to diminish what you said, Tarik, that this is a very complicated issue because there's a lot of different nuances. Like for me, one of the ongoing topics that really is complicated is the one and done, right? This idea of, well, if you go to college, first of all, you have to go to college before you can enter into a major league sport. But then you have to do it for a certain period of time. You're not even eligible. And where the NCAA is working in tandem with professional sports leagues, making decisions about young men and women's futures, about their own livelihood. Like, what are your guys' thoughts about the one and done culture?
I'm happy you brought that up because I have plenty of thoughts on that. I think it's very interesting because if you watch the history, there wasn't a one and done before. You can go straight to the NBA out of high school. You've got the Vince Carters, you got the Kevin Garnetts, you've got LeBron James, but then they did away with that and all of a sudden went back to the one and done. The question is why? It goes back to money. It's interesting we're having this conversation about money, and then you talk about college football and you talk about the playoff system. They didn't want to get rid of the bowls because they're big money makers. So it's all about money is what I see with the NCAA. However, they don't want to talk about money when it comes to athletes. So I find that very ironic. And then within that, different sports have different rules. So baseball, you can go straight to the majors right out of high school. Mm-hmm. But basketball, one and done. College football, you've got to be a junior. So it's interesting. Like, is the NCAA going to be kind of a minor league? And if so, are you going to pay them like a minor league or allow them to make money off of their likeness? And I think that's what the governor is trying to do in California. But
I am of two minds about one and dones. First, I hate it because
you're a Caucasian male that loves college sports and you want to.
And
he didn't dispute that.
Vince Carter played for Carolina. He didn't go straight. But,
he did. You're right.
Huh? Yeah.
You're right.
Yeah. But it's like I'm an old geezer, and
truer words have never been spoken on this podcast.
True. And I remember the days when I was the designated person to bring the TV in to school for the ACC tournament.
That's because you were the only one that had a TV.
No. And I would carry the TV from classroom to classroom, and we would just sit and watch. And you knew the players' names, and you knew we're going to be following these guys for 4 years. You feel like you know them. It's amazing. And now it's like, okay, well, I'm not going to get too attached to this guy because he's going to be in the NBA. And I don't know, it's just a nostalgia piece for me, really wanting to know a player and watch him develop. On the flip side, people get injured, and they could miss out on millions of dollars, and I totally get it. But, I mean, college basketball, which is my favorite sport, is really it's changed quite a bit, and it's a little bit hard to get used to. But I get why they come and go.
I want to throw in one more piece that kind of piggyback off your point about injury. So a lot of times we're talking about the Zions and these people that are obviously going to make millions as long as they don't get injured. But there was a former standard volleyball player by the name of Haley Hodson who said during a legislative testimony in July, only a fraction of college athletes eventually turn professional. And for the rest, college is the only time they have to profit off their hard-earned athletic successes. Mm-hmm. So that's another argument. Like, it's less than 5%. It was 2%. It's around that single-digit range of individuals out of college that actually make it to professional sports. So how about all these other kids that are playing, and this is where they can make money off their likeness, but they never get that opportunity? So that's another argument.
Yeah.
Well, I grew up in a town called Bellingham, Washington, and it was the single-A farm system for the Seattle Mariners. And I remember when Ken Griffey Jr. at age 16 was the first pick in the draft, and he spent his first season in single-A ball in Bellingham, Washington, and he made his major league debut at age 18. He was 18 years old when he hit his first home run.
That's insane.
And so part of the challenge is making widespread policy that on some level somebody is not going to benefit from it. Because when you think about the LeBrons or Zions, there's people that are just, barring a horrific career ending injury, they're going to make it. They're going to make it at the next level, and they're going to make money. And yet, do you restrict those few to make it fair and equal for everyone else? Or do you open that up to where even though everybody is available to make money, only a few will probably profit from it? I think one of the challenges for me, and it is a complicated issue, and I don't pretend that 3 dudes in Charlotte, North Carolina have figured it all out within 30 minutes.
Close.
I'm glad
Close.
I'm considered a dude.
Yeah, honorary dude.
Okay.
But I think one of the challenges as a mental health professional and sort of the approach that I take with my clients is I'm very person-centered. And a lot of the legislation about the NCAA is not about looking out for the best interests of the student athlete. It's just not. It's not. It's about looking out for whether it be the bottom line or the reputation or the prestige of the university. It's not about the student athlete. And I think there's a lot of space in between paying them, not paying them, making them eligible for endorsement, not making them eligible, to where the NCAA and college institutions by and large can really improve actually making policy changes to where it really is about benefiting and what's best for the student athletes, whether it's making tuition for graduate schools, free, like scholarships extend beyond just undergrad, whether it's lifelong health insurance, for collegiate athletes, whether it's a percentage of the school's earnings that goes into some postgraduate trust that they now have access. There's a lot more nuanced ways, but I see some of those conversations pop up here and there, but by and large, you have 2 very powerful institutions that are just digging in their heels, and it's become their Alamo where there's not a lot that's moving back and forth.
Yep. Well said.
So there's a lot more that we could talk about it, but we're really interested in you also. We'd love to hear what your comments and thoughts are on the subject. Be sure to leave us comments below. I really want to appreciate.
Appreciate you.
Yeah.
Good.
That's one of your catchphrases. Tarik appreciates us. I do want to say thank you for our guest, Tarik Sloussi, for bringing a lot of knowledge and experience and point of view to this conversation. That's it for this edition of the Shrink Tank Podcast. For Tarik Sloussi and Frank Gaskell, I'm Jonathan Hedderly in Charlotte. Tell your friends about us and make it a great week.